Welcome, everyone. We have people joining us from coast to coast joining us today, so we're so delighted you're able to join us. My name is Christiane Schofield. I'm the Manager of Communications and Strategic Initiatives for the Canadian Hard of Hearing Association. We're going to jump into our guest presentation very soon, but first off, I'd like to note a few features of this webinar. So there's a question box located to the left of your screen. This is where you can submit any questions you might have during the presentation. We'll get to those questions as part of the Q&A period at the end of the session. If at any point you have technical difficulties, please use that same Q&A widget on your screen to submit your technical difficulty. One of our technical assistants will be happy to help you. You'll notice we have captioning for this webinar. The captioning can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any difficulties with the captioning, please submit a question through the question box and we'll get straight to it. Before we get on with our guest presenter today, I'd like to introduce our National Executive Director, Mr. Christopher Sutton, to introduce our special guest speaker for this inaugural educational seminar. Christopher?
Thank you, Christiane, and good afternoon, everyone. In honor of Better Hearing and Speech Month, the Canadian Hard of Hearing Association has been working hard to provide new resources for our members from coast to coast living with hearing loss to families, friends, and others. We're very excited to have this first webinar that we think will be very important for many people when it comes to music. People with hearing loss tend to remember that item in their lives very much and are very excited about being able to listen to music. So this is our first webinar, and we plan to have many, as we really want to be the go-to organization when people want to learn about hearing loss, learn about treatment, want to learn about coping mechanisms, and so forth. So with that, I want to introduce you to Dr. Marshall Chasin. Marshall has been a longtime friend of mine, and I'm so happy to have him joining us today. Marshall is a doctor of audiology at the Musicians Clinic of Canada. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto in linguistics and an associate professor in the School of Communication Disorders and Sciences at Western University. He is the author of over 200 articles, 8 books, including Musicians and the Prevention of Hearing Loss. In addition, Marshall writes a monthly column in the Hearing Health Review called Back to Basics. Dr. Chasin has been the recipient of many awards over the years, including the 2012 Queen Elizabeth II Silver Jubilee Awards and the 2017 Canada 150 Medal. He is developing a new TTS app called Temporary Hearing Loss Test App. So Marshall is a very, very busy person, as you can see. And Marshall, thank you for joining us today, and very much looking forward to your webinar.
Thank you very much, Chris, and also Christiane. I know the CV tends to make me sound boring. I'm not. Well, I am, but I'm not that boring, I would hope. The topic is hearing loss, getting the music back. Traditionally, hearing aid manufacturers, the industry, audiologists even, are more concerned with hearing and speech rather in noisy places and how to optimize that. And that's laudable, and that's very, very important. But sometimes they forget that we don't just listen to speech, we listen to music as well. So I'm going to be talking about some of the little tricks of the trade that the industry has used. And this is an evolving, changing thing. What I would say today may not be completely accurate a month or even 6 months from now. Certainly with the use of smartphones like iPhones, we have much better control over our phone, our hearing aids rather, and we can actually use it as a third microphone where we can place our smartphone or Bluetooth transmitter in a remote location. This is the ear. It's pretty exciting stuff. There's about 100,000 moving parts if you count all the nerve endings. The outer ear to the left is a minor problem, usually wax occlusion. The middle ear behind the eardrum would have ear infections. Both are medically or surgically treatable. The inner ear, the size of my small tip of my small finger, has 13,000 to 15,000 nerve endings. And when some of those nerve endings die, we have a problem. And then neurologically, that's taken up to the brain. And you can have a hearing difficulty anywhere along that line, including the nerve or even the first joining of the nerve from the ear called the synapse. This is a completely inaccurate, wrong picture, but it's very romantic. This was posed in the 1880s by a gentleman named Brown, who thought that's how the ear devolved sound into music. He actually rubbed his pinna, his outer ear, with his finger, and he claimed to hear D and E and F, the different notes in the piano keyboard. It's not true. I've tried it, and I've checked it out. It doesn't work. We know that the inner ear, with the 13 to 15,000 nerve endings, is the one that turns sounds into sounds like the piano keyboard. The cochlea, the inner ear, it's sometimes called, that's where the 13 to 15,000 nerve endings. We just really found out recently in a historical sense, about how the ear works, or we think the ear works. When I went to school, 1979 to 1981, when I took my master's, we had 3/4 of the nerve endings in the ear. We just didn't know what they were there for. We knew that 1/4 of the nerve endings took the sound up to the brain, and then the other 3/4 just sat there, and we didn't really know. And about that time, someone figured that out, that the other 3/4 receive sound from the brain back to the ear, a feedback loop. And that's been a great boon to our profession. It certainly has helped us understand how the ear works. It's a very active feedback mechanism. I can't really talk about music or anything unless I talk about this guy. This is an age issue. For those over the age of 50, we all know him as Lieutenant Columbo, a bumbling 1970s sitcom, a bumbling detective who looked rumpled. He didn't look all that with it, but he was, of course. And just before he left the crime scene, which, by the way, he always succeeded in solving the crime, just before he left, he would say, "Oh, one more question." And you knew that question was going to come back and haunt the bad guy at the end of the movie. For those guys that are under the age of 50, you'll recognize this gentleman as the grandfather on The Princess Bride. So he's been everywhere. But the question that I'm always asked, just one more question, as someone walks out of my office, is should I buy an iPod or an MP3 player for my son or grandson or whatever, daughter, for Christmas time? And so let me spend a brief amount of time just getting to the bottom of that issue. There's something called the 80-90 rule. And what that means is that it's okay to listen for 80% volume for 90 minutes a day. That will give you roughly 1/2 of your daily exposure of sound. 80% volume for 90 minutes a day. This was actually the work of Brian Fligor. He calls it the Fligor. I call it the Fligor rule. He's too mild-mannered to name something after himself, but that was his doctorate work. And so it's the maximum settings to obtain 1/2 of your dose, 80% volume for 90 minutes a day. If your favorite song comes on, turn up the volume, enjoy it thoroughly. Just turn it back down to a more reasonable level after. If you're listening to more than 90 minutes a day, maybe you shouldn't wear your iPod. In fact, it might be, antisocial, which has nothing to do with hearing. This is a picture of Brian Fligor's bottom half of his face and body. And he found something very interesting. It wasn't just 80-90 rule, the 80% volume for 90 minutes a day, but it depended on which earphone you use. So this is a graph showing the same MP3 player, same music, same everything, volume along the bottom, gain setting from volume 3 to volume 10, and in decibels, how loud something is up the y-axis. And this is the same everything, just with different earphones. So one earphone, the purple near the bottom, at volume 6 or 7 may generate 80 to 85 decibels. That same volume setting with a different earphone may also generate well over 100 decibels. So if it's very difficult to say definitively whether one MP3 player in volume 6 is a potentially damaging level. An audiologist such as myself can assess that, and I do that all the time. I drop a small microphone into a person's ear while they're listening to it, and I can tell them what the output is to make sure it's not damaging damaging, or the 80-90 rule. So nothing wrong with earphones, just don't use it for more than an hour and a half a day, or if you're using the volume up near the top, maybe think about reducing it. One advantage, one thing that you can do if you're using earphones is use earphones that isolate you from the environment. That is, the reason that earphones or Walkmans, we used to call in the 1980s, CD players in the 1990s, now MP3 players, are potentially damaging is that we take it outside. And the first thing that happens outside is that we turn up the volume to compensate for the background noise. And that's the danger with portable music like MP3 players or iPods. Not that you have anything in the ear. The ear, after all, doesn't know whether it's listening to music from 25 millimeters away or 25 meters away. You always adjust it to what's comfortable. But the nice thing about isolated earphones is that it isolates you from the truck going by the construction site. So you don't have to turn up the volume over the background noise, such that the overall level is much, much quieter. There are some manufacturers that actually make earphones that ensure that sounds do not exceed a certain level. There are many different manufacturers that do that. There's a sucky picture of a cat wearing earphones. Zogby International, which is a large polling firm in the States, about a decade ago did a study of a large sample of young people, and they said, well, what would you do? And about 70% would turn down the volume, very reasonable. 42% would listen less often, and about a third, maybe a little bit more, would use special isolator earphones. So these are all very reasonable things to do. If you're not sure, don't. But that's true of driving. That's true of anything else in life. Also, beware of trucks coming up behind you if you do isolate you from the environment. So if you are a jogger, you may not want to use this strategy. So 80-90 rule for MP3 players. Use isolated earphones, moderation, listen less often if it's too loud, but watch out for traffic. So that's what I wanted to tell you about that Peter Falk issue. So how loud? How loud is too loud? Well, we know from industry and factory that music exposure is almost like noise exposure from a factory. There are some subtle differences, but essentially it's the same thing. We do know that anything over 85 decibels, if you listen to it long enough, will cause a permanent hearing loss. But there's something called the exchange rate. Well, and in fact, we use something called the 3 decibel exchange rate. We do know that 85 hours a week, 85 decibels for 40 hours a week will eventually, after a year or so, cause a measurable hearing loss. But it turns out that's the very same thing as 88 decibels for only 20 hours a week, 91 decibels for only 10 hours a week. A 3 decibel increase means that you effectively doubled your damage, and you should only be exposed half the time. 94 for 5 hours a week, 97 for 2.5 hours a week. So you can go to a rock concert and be exposed to 97 decibels for a couple of hours on a Friday night, and that will not hurt your hearing as long as you don't maybe mow your lawn the next day. Better still get someone else to do it for you. So we're not talking about decibels per se. We're talking about the dose that you get. And we never want to exceed 100% of your dose. In fact, you can buy these dosimeters, and there are some apps on your phone which are dosimeters, and a red light flashes when you hit 100%. This is an app that I use on it's only available on iPhones. Androids tend to have some weird compression going on with them, and you can't use a lot of these devices with Android phones, but iPhones are pretty rigorous in how they demand their designers to work. So this is from Australia. It's a sound log dosimeter app. It's free. It gives you spot by spot or minute by minute levels, but more importantly, it gives you a number. You've been exposed 56% of your time, for example, to noise, or 0, and it gives you all that information. What is 85 decibels? Well, people don't have a good gut feeling for what 85 decibels really is, by the way. Well, 85 decibels is soft rock. It can be louder. It's also the dial tone. For those that still have a landline with a dial tone, 85 decibels is the level of a dial tone. Nobody in their right mind would think that a dial tone is loud. It is loud enough to cause a damaging level of hearing loss, but you have to listen to it, of course, for about 40 hours a week for about 52 weeks of the year before you get anything permanent. But again, nobody would think that noise that's potentially damaging is all that loud. So there's a misjudge between what we tell people and what they say will do. I can say turn down the volume of the music, and they'll say, "Yeah, right." Yeah, I don't know if you know what that is, but that's metric for this. It's just something they wouldn't do. Instead, it's best to say, go enjoy your music, turn up the volume when your favorite song comes on, just turn it back down to a more reasonable level afterwards. Half volume maybe, depends on which earphone on an MP3 player. Try this. Next time you're not feeling too well, stick your head in the toilet and flush it. Take off your hearing aids before you do this, of course. And stick your head in the bowl and flush it. That's 85 decibels. It's about 77 if you just stand back and flush it from about half a meter away. Not that I've ever measured that, but so 85 decibels is not all that loud. Yet it can be damaging. So let's change gears now. That's what this slide is. So what do you do when you have a hearing loss? You have a hearing aid. Maybe you're very happy with it with speech, but maybe not so happy with it for music. So let's talk about 3 differences between speech and music. First, they have different shapes of the spectra. More energy in the lower bass notes, the left-hand side of the piano keyboard versus the right side of the piano keyboard, perhaps. Differing sound levels. Speech can be very quiet. Even quiet music can be very loud. And something called crest factors. So the first one, if you look at what we call the spectrum, so along the bottom you'll see the piano keyboard essentially, the low bass notes on the left side to the higher pitched notes, the tinkly notes on the right-hand side. And on the y-axis going up and down is how loud it is. And although a violin, the blue one, is higher up than speech, and the purple or the magenta speech, it's not that dissimilar. It has most of its energy in the lower bass notes, and it gradually falls off in the higher bass notes. So there can be some similarities between speech and music. But then when you add in a drum to it, and all bets are off. There's no relationship between how a drum would sound and how speech sounds. And music can be very different as well. Differing sound levels, the second element. The loudest level of speech is the vowel ah. I can artificially say ah really loud, like ah, and overdrive your computer that you're listening on right now, or even perhaps overdrive your hearing aids. But the loudest element of speech is about 80 decibels. The quietest level of music is about 80 decibels, with peaks well over 100 decibels. So it's not unusual to have speech being down here and music being up here. I'm not sure I'm on the screen, but music can be very, very loud in comparison to speech. Crest factor. Crest factor is how peaky the sound is. So it's technically the difference between the peak and the average. And for speech, it's about 12 decibels. For music, it's about 18 or 19 decibels. So music tends to be much peakier than speech. And this is important when we try to fit someone with a hearing aid. We want to make sure that those peaks don't cause a tolerance problem and cause you to rip off the hearing aid. So a quick comparison between speech and music. Speech on average is about 65 decibels. Music can be well in excess of 100 decibels. Speech has a crest factor of about 12 dB, where music is much more peaky. Speech kind of falls off at about a certain level per octave, 6 decibels per octave. It has that natural roll-off. Music can be that, or it can have variable slopes. It can be high-frequency emphasis, low-frequency emphasis, the left-hand side of the piano keyboard, the right side. It's all over the place. With speech, when we fit a hearing aid, we have a well-defined target we're aiming for. It's disingenuous and erroneous to think that we have one single target for music. And in fact, classical music may be slightly different than pop music. Well, it is actually. So what about hard of hearing musicians, or just the rest of us mere mortals who just like to listen to music on occasion? That's my parents, my cottage facing into the nice placid lake. And on occasion, my mom and dad used to like to go to listen to concerts all the time, even though they're not musicians themselves. Well, let's talk about the first element, which is really very technically sounding, but don't panic. It's not. It's called the peak input limiting level. Think of that as the ceiling or the highest point that can get into the hearing aid. So you have the microphone, then because we're dealing with digital hearing aids, it has a digital analog to digital converter, an A to D converter, and then it applies it into the hearing aid for it to work with all its magic and its program programs that your audiologist will set up for you. Well, most hearing aids have a limit that if it's over a certain level, it will just not accept it. And with many hearing aids, it's about 85 to 90 decibels, and that makes perfect sense because the loudest element of speech is 80 decibels, so it can allow speech to get through unaffected. It's okay for speech, but maybe not okay for music. We sometimes call this a front-end problem. We tend to overload it. Now, I think so. Think of it as a bridge, and that little plane that's flying into the bridge, something's got to give. If that plane either doesn't duck down and go under the bridge, or the bridge go up, there's going to be a problem. That plane is going to be in pieces. Now, this is a fake. I can tell you it's a fake, although it looks pretty good. And I can tell you because the drivers are not veering off to one side. They're just driving down the middle of the lane as if no plane is in front of them. So I think this is Photoshop. Besides, I don't remember this happening in real life. But that's what would happen if the input to the hearing aid, such as music, which is so loud, just doesn't get into the hearing aid effectively. You have to go under the bridge is a very good strategy. Overpass analogy, imagine a double-decker truck not making it through, or a big tall bus or other vehicle not quite making it through the usable range. This is a case in England where a double-decker bus became a 1.5-decker bus because the music, the ceiling, the bridge was too low. That's another case. So I did an experiment where I actually created a hearing aid. Now, I was going to play audio files for you, and let me just see if it works first. So what I did, the hearing aid had that peak bridge level, the input limiting level at 115 decibels, which is the limit of the modern microphones we use with hearing aids, down to a lower level, 105, 96 to 92, and back up to 115. So I'm going to play for you music through that scenario, and I want you to listen to it if indeed we can play it. Now, it's not on completely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some music from my computer, and if that works, great. If it doesn't, I'll give you a website. So what you're going to be listening to is 100 decibels music, which is not all that loud, and I'll put my microphone up to my computer. So it's 115 dB, and it's not working. So I will. Oh. 115 decibels. A little bit of distortion. 105. 96. This is probably the best hearing aid out there for a long time. 92, entry-level hearing aids. Back to 115. I just turned that off because you don't have to listen to it anymore. But it just shows that once music is distorted so early on in the system, it is you can spend all you want to make the programming changes or have your audiologist make the changes, but if it's distorted, nothing will help. So the idea is not to have it distorted at the front end. Software changes, you could try it. Some manufacturers say that they want to boost the mid frequencies, some the high, some the low. They don't work. Once it's distorted, you have to fix it at the front end. So what about a hearing aid? You have a hearing aid, you love your hearing aid for speech, but it just falls short of music. So you come in to see me in my office, you've already purchased a hearing aid with unfortunately a very low ceiling or low peak input limiting level. What can you do? Well, here are some critical strategies. You can lower the volume on the input. I'll come back to each one. You can use an external device like an FM system. You can use Scotch tape. I know that sounds bizarre, but it does work. And you can simply take off the hearing aids. So the first one is if you're listening to music in your car or at home, it's always better to turn down the volume of your radio or your stereo at home, and if necessary, turn up the volume of your hearing aid later to compensate for it. But if you do it the other way, you turn up the radio volume, you're going to run into this distortion problem. So reduce the volume of the radio in your car, and if necessary, turn up the volume on your hearing aids. And that means go under the bridge, duck under the bridge. You can use an external device with your hearing aids where that external device has their own volume control. And it can be something as simple as a smartphone, and maybe you turn off the hearing aids and you only receive the input from your smartphone, and you can reduce the volume of your smartphone. So what actually is digitized and ultimately comes in through the Bluetooth route in your hearing aid is in a region that the front end can handle without distortion. And so you can hook up a neck loop or direct audio input or even a loop system in the environment. Just turn down the volume of the loop system, and that will again be like ducking under the bridge. Scotch tape. I know it sounds really low-tech and bizarre, but Scotch tape, if you place 3 or 4 layers of Scotch tape over your own hearing aid microphones, it fools your hearing aid into thinking what's coming in is more speech-like. That is, it lessens or attenuates the sound. And so, again, it's like ducking under the bridge. And finally, it turns out that speech is quiet. But if you when you went to your audiologist last time, they would have set your hearing aid to have a lot of amplification for soft level inputs like consonant sounds. They would have less amplification for mid-level inputs, and sometimes very little amplification for very, very loud sounds like ah and e and some of the other sounds. And it turns out that music being louder than speech, in many cases you can have up to a 50 or 60 decibel hearing loss and not require any amplification at all. So it's best just to simply take off your hearing aids while listening to loud music. This is a chart measured at 1,000, and if you look down the left blue column, that's the degree of your hearing loss. So let's look at about a 55 decibel hearing loss. For maybe average speech, you need 20 decibels. Maybe loud speech, you only need 10 decibels. Well, for sounds more in the realm of music where there's much louder inputs, you might not require any amplification at all. And so sometimes it's best just to take off the hearing aid that cannot handle the louder inputs, and people can do very well with this environment. So that's another good strategy. Now let's talk about, as an audiologist, where I would choose one hearing aid over another at the very beginning for you to purchase. And some hearing aid companies have handled this problem in different ways. So these are what I call technical innovations. And one of them is to use a microphone that was just simply less sensitive to the low frequency sounds. Another technique is that you can take this range I'm talking about, the input, the hearing aids can handle up to about 90 decibels, 95 decibels without distortion. Well, nobody says it has to go from 0 to 95. It could be from 10 to 105 or 20 to 115 decibels. Modern microphones can certainly handle inputs of 115 decibels, so that might be a good strategy. Another strategy that a lot of manufacturers use now is while it's still in the analog form, so it comes through the microphone, they would have a compressor which reduces the sound, applies it to the digitization process, the analog to digital converter, and then once in, digitally reestablished. And again, it's like ducking into the bridge. And most recently, there are what we call post-16-bit architecture hearing aids. Up to even a year ago, all hearing aids were 16-bit. And all that meant is that they couldn't really handle inputs louder than about 95 decibels. This is an idea that I thought of, and it was actually called the Schmidt-Chasen modification. But it's simply a microphone that's less sensitive to the lower frequency sounds where a lot of the intensity is. If you needed the amplification there, you would use your hearing aid program to give you more gain for that. But what happens to the microphone is that the low frequency fundamental in the music, the left and the middle of the piano keyboard would significantly reduce in sound level such that when you apply it to the hearing aid, it wouldn't overdrive it and cause that distortion. So this is with a broadband microphone, and this is the distortion level with this little trick. Just changing the microphone. Again, broadband distortion and almost no distortion. So it really has resolved some of the problems that we have had. The only company that seemed to want to use that was Unitron. And even they don't use that really anymore because they have these post 16-bit hearing aids I'm going to be talking about very shortly. Shifting the dynamic range upwards. So nobody said that the usable range of speech, what we call the dynamic range, between the softest sound the hearing aid can generate and the loudest sound the hearing aid can generate, that whole range there can be shifted up a little bit higher. But what I can't, there are ways of doing that, and there are some companies that have been marketing this for the last decade. Pretty much all companies now use this technique because it makes so much sense. So again, think of this as ducking under your bridge. And so you have front end compression. What that means is that it runs off the preamplifier of your microphone of your hearing aid. It reduces it. Compression means it reduces the sound, puts it into the analog to digital converter. You digitize it. And then when it's in the hearing aid, it can put back what it did at the very beginning. And virtually all the hearing aid companies are using this technique. It's a low-tech innovation, but again, it's been around for many, many years. And finally, most hearing aid companies now offer hearing aids that are based on 18 or 19 or 20 bits. And all that means is that we're allowed to give more headroom for the input. So the input can be up around what the microphone can handle, 110 or 115 decibels, without it distorting. And then it gets into the hearing aid in a healthy form without distortion. And then you can apply the programming to that as you so desire. I'm going to turn that off. A nice side effect, a good unexpected side effect of trying to optimize a hearing aid for music is that it turns out that music isn't the only thing that's up there in terms of intensity, but our own voice. Now, when I said that speech was 65 decibels at about a meter away, that was a meter away. But a person's own voice, I'm only a matter of inches or centimeters away from your own hearing aid, 6 or 7 inches at most, maybe about 10 to 12 centimeters away. My own voice at the level of my own hearing aid is extremely high. And so if we find a hearing aid that can resolve this front-end problem and handle music, the hard of hearing person's own voice should sound a lot better. It's as simple as that. And everything else. Well, I've really only been speaking for a half an hour, a little bit more. I'm going to leave some questions here. I'm going to maybe talk for another 10 minutes tops. Not that I've left everything to the last moment, but unless you take care of that front-end problem where the microphone that leads into this digitization, because we deal with digital hearing aids, is done properly, it's going to sound really, really awful distorted. There's a website if you wanted to listen to those audio samples, again at different levels, that I maintain. It's my son's website actually. It's www.chasin, my name, CHASIN.ca/ and then the words distorted_music. Distorted, DISTORTED, then an underscore. That's a capital letter. It's next to the 0 there. And then music, MUSIC. So you can go to that website. There's a little blurb explaining it all. So it can give you that overview. So let's talk about everything else. What constitutes the best hearing aid out there? Well, there's been a move in our field to have many channels in a hearing aid. In fact, if you spend thousands of dollars for the top-of-the-line hearing aid, the difference is that may have like 20 or 30 different channels. It's like dividing your piano keyboard into only 2 or 3 white notes for every channel and handling every one of those notes a little bit different. And that's been shown to be very useful for improving speech. Not so useful, though, for improving music. Imagine playing the violin or listening to the violin or the clarinet or the guitar. When we play music, not only do we hear the note name, let's say I'm playing on my clarinet A, and it has an energy at A, which is in a certain pitch or frequency region, but then it's made up of the harmonics. And it's the harmonics that give music the beauty, the intelligibility. The reason I know my clarinet's not a flute is I can look at the harmonics. The reason I can appreciate violin is that it has a relative balance between the lower frequency, left-hand side of the piano keyboard, fundamental, and the higher frequencies, the harmonics on the right side. So imagine a hearing aid that has many different channels. It handles one side of the piano keyboard differently than the other, and it alters the balance of music. So there should be actually a single channel. Now, there's no such thing anymore as a single channel hearing aid. There used to be in the 1980s and early 90s, but people got away from that thinking, well, more is better. Well, when it comes to music, more is not better. And I've been suggesting to the hearing aid industry for many years to build a single channel hearing aid. There are some tricks that your audiologist can do to program every channel to be almost identical. It's not quite the same thing, but it might be better than to have something a little bit more complex. Turns out that for music, it turns out that the music program is actually quite similar to what the speech in quiet program is. So you might have a speech in quiet, and the music program isn't all that different. It's going to have similar compression characteristics of speech. I suggested that in 2004, and that was verified by a 2009 article. So far, it's very similar, except for it should be one channel. You have to turn off all the fancy features. Your hearing aid has noise reduction systems. You have feedback management systems. And your audiologist can turn that off. So a music program would have less is more idea. It has as little fancy features as possible. So you don't need an expensive hearing aid for music. In fact, at best, you need something that's a little bit less expensive. Frequency transposition. I haven't really talked about that, but all hearing aids nowadays have what we call frequency transposition or shifting, which takes the sound from the right-hand side of the piano keyboard and moves it to a lower pitch somewhere in the middle or in some extreme cases the left side of the piano keyboard, presumably where you have better hearing. So it takes it from the right-hand side of your hearing test or your audiogram and moves it towards an area that you have better hearing. This has been wonderful for speech. It's improved the intelligibility for speech, but it would destroy music, because what happens is that when I play a certain note, I'm expecting to hear a harmonic at, let's say, 3,000 hertz, not 2,900 hertz, not 2,800, but exactly 3,000, or else it'll sound flat. And so if you have this frequency transposition working, it will sound odd. So you have to disable the frequency transposition. Then there's another little parameter that your output should be a little bit lower because the peaks of music are so peaky, and you don't want that to cause any irritation. So by and large, a music program, once you've taken care of the first bit, whether it's ducking under the bridge or having the bridge go up with some of these new technical innovations, is not that dissimilar than to your normal program 1, which is your speech in quiet listening situations, turning off some of the bells and whistles, but other than that, it's not that bad. And everything else. So here's a summary. So a music program is very similar to your normal program, or usually that's your speech in quiet program. You turn off the advanced features, and the big difference is the built-in technology of your particular hearing aid. And if you see a hearing aid where there's ads in the newspaper or TV showing a sexy looking musician smiling away, the odds are that that's all they have in that manufacturer. So that manufacturer has missed the boat. And in fact, some of the larger manufacturers have really dragged their heels on this, their feet, whatever the acronym, whatever the saying is, and it's the smaller manufacturers that have gone to this. So get a hearing aid that doesn't distort with loud music. Your audiologist can certainly talk to you about that. And one question is, how many bits does this hearing aid have? And if they say 16-bit, say no thank you. But if it's a 20 or 24-bit system or anything above 16, I think you should be able to handle music very, very well. And then have them just disable some of the bells and whistles that are only found on some of the more expensive hearing aids to make a very rudimentary, almost linear, nothing fancy program, and that would be the best program for you. Now it's almost 1:45. Oh, and of course, one of the best slides is thank goodness we live now rather than 1988. So a lot of changes has occurred in 30 years. Remember the flock of seagulls for those that are old enough, and remember those wonderful styles we had in 1988 with their big puffed up shoulders. So we couldn't really do much in 1988 that we can do in 2018. So if you've had a bad experience with listening to music and hearing aids, it's time to see your audiologist. If you don't want to do that and you want to have something low tech, try those strategies of reducing the volume on the input to the hearing aid, whether you're listening with your smartphone, reduce that volume. In your home stereo system or even TV, reduce the volume. On your car, reduce the volume. And maybe in your hearing aid, increase the volume, not the other way around. This is my main email, marshall.chasen@rogers.com. There's a website called themusiciansclinics.com. They have a lot of FAQs, frequently asked questions, that I think you might get a kick out of that because it has some really good information. Also, a blog that I sometimes write. I'm not as regular as I used to be. At least not as regular in terms of writing as I used to be. Hearinghealthmatters.org. It's actually a wonderful blog. It's written by some leading people in our industry, and it has issues about children in hearing loss, international concerns in hearing loss, technology issues. A review of patents is a frequently used column. Dizziness. There's a whole section that's just on dizziness, and you can bet your bottom dollar is if it's on hearinghealthmatters.org, it probably is state of the art. And I have one called Hear the Music, where I talk about all things music, whether it's music itself or hearing loss prevention for music or music and hearing aids. So I think what I'll do is, if there are any questions, I can turn my attention to the question answer.
Sure, Marshall. Christiane here, and thank you so much. Great presentation. There are a few questions coming in, so we'll just go ahead and I'll ask you those questions. The first one is, I wear both a hearing aid and a cochlear implant and love music. However, music is not always the best. What are some tips you would suggest for me to be able to enjoy the music?
What a good question. Well, obviously, for the group that's listening, it makes perfect sense. Cochlear implants are wonderful for speech. They are less than stellar for music. That has nothing to do with the manufacturer. It has a little bit to do with the programming and the algorithms. But because of the way they are designed and the way they are inserted into the ear, the lower frequency rhythm, the mid and the lower frequency, the left-hand side of the piano keyboard, just is not transmitted into the ear with cochlear implants. And so people that wear cochlear implants, if they have a cochlear implant in one ear and a hearing aid in the other ear, what we sometimes call bimodal, two modes, is probably the best. The hearing aids give you that low frequency sound that the cochlear implants can't, and the bandwidth and the range of the cochlear implant gives you the mid and the higher frequency sounds. Sometimes the hearing aid that you do wear is less than stellar, and try that trick with maybe having 3 or 4 or sometimes 5, depending on the thickness of the tape, layers of Scotch tape over your hearing aid. See if that improves things. Don't do that with a cochlear implant. Do it with your hearing aid. I don't want you to screw up your cochlear implant. Incidentally, cochlear implants also suffer from the same problem, and so you'll see many cochlear implants moving to an 18 or 20 or 24-bit system as well as hearing aids. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Marshall. And please, everyone, feel free to send in some questions. Marshall is still here with us for another 15 minutes or so, so I will continue asking the questions I do have here, but there is still room for more. So, Marshall, the next question is, where do you see the area progressing in the future? Is it going to get better, or should we keep our expectations realistic?
What a good question that is. Again, I don't know where. I don't know where the music and hearing aids, or hearing aids not just for speech area, will go. I know that in the last 2 years, maybe year and a half, there's been major improvements. I wrote the first article on this in 2004, and the hearing aid industry ignored me for a decade. But that was a long time ago, and they have now come around such that what gets into the hearing aid can be very useful. I think one of the big changes is the use of smartphones. If you have an Apple-based phone, an OS operating phone, an Apple phone, think of that as your third microphone or your third hearing aid. And people may, in fact, want to listen to your Apple phone through the Bluetooth transmission into the hearing aids. Some manufacturers can only go in stereo, in mono. There is one manufacturer now coming out with a stereo sound to both ears. If you're using Android, there is a problem in the sense that Android tends to have what we call a delay. There's a bit of a time delay between when it's sent to you and when you receive it. And if you're lip reading someone or watching someone perform, it's going to be very confusing. So it's best to actually close your eyes while you're using the Android system so you don't have visual confusion that occurs. So I think that's probably the best thing, the smartphone control and manipulation of music.
Great. This is an interesting one. What can live music venues do to best help hearing aid wearers attend their shows?
Good question as well. Europe is head and shoulders above North America in this, in that many performance venues in Europe, according to the regulations of the EU, European, what does EU stand for? European market? I grew up at the time we called it the European Community, but I'm older. But the EU has regulations defining how loud music can be in the venues to begin with, and if they're over a certain level, they have to either turn themselves down or take other acoustic control. So the room itself tends to be a little bit quieter, not excessively, but slightly quieter. But I would like to see more acoustic treatment of the live performance venues. There's a concept called the LEDE, LEDE. That's an acronym that stands for Live End, Dead End. And the back or the rear wall behind the musicians should be highly damped. There should be curtains there. There should be acoustic treatment there. And the opposite wall that they're playing into should be live, reflective. And so depending on where you sit there, you will get the initial reflection of the sound or the initial sound, not the fifth reflection or the echo. The echo degrades the sound significantly. So you might want to just walk around the venue, especially if it has adhered to this lead concept, and find the right place. There might be some locations that are very good, some locations that are very bad. Concert halls have the same thing. We have an absolutely beautiful concert hall in Canada, in Toronto, called the Kerner Hall, next to the museum, which has beautiful warm sound. Unfortunately, we also have the Roy Thompson Hall, which is a circular type of hall, where if you hold your head straight, you'll get a completely different sound than when you tilt it to one side. And so some halls are just better than other halls for that. You may want to choose one performance venue over another. You might it's not just the beer that you have and not just the people and the parking, but maybe some halls are just better than other halls. And you can experiment with that. Okay.
Great. This is an interesting one, and I apologize ahead of time for my pronunciation on some wording in this question. It is Ramadan, and Muslims listen to a lot of Quranic recitation in this month. The recitation, if well done, is melodic. Would the same strategies you mentioned work for listening to the recitation, which is voice and does not use any musical instruments?
Vocal music is beautiful. In the case of that music, during Ramadan, it's notoriously what we call triconsonantal, 3 consonants, and the rest vowels. So you have these long vowels joining up the consonants, and it's almost like a Gregorian chant. It's really very beautiful. But to answer your question, vocal music, even slightly amplified vocal music without the instrumentation, should be viewed as speech. So it has many speech characteristics. You don't have to worry about music. Now, setting a hearing aid for music, by the way, has no downside, has no deleterious effects. So if you wanted to use your music channel, it's like chicken soup. It won't hurt you. But vocal music, to answer your question specifically, is just like speech or similar to speech.
Thank you. Next question. What kind of earphones should I consider when listening to music over the ear, in the ear, or a loop? Or I currently use a high-end line of headphones that I wear over my ears using a Telco. However, I'm not sure if this is giving me the ability to appreciate the music as much as I could.
If you wear hearing aids, you should actually optimally be listening with your hearing aids and or cochlear implant in place. And you could couple the earphones through Bluetooth with your own hearing aids. The hearing aids have been optimized for your own hearing loss, and they should sound the best. There are some over-the-ear cans, we call them. The larger they are, the louder sounds can get through. And you may need slightly louder sounds and louder outputs for you to hear that. If you have a more mild hearing loss or you have no hearing loss, it doesn't matter whether they have the insert earphones that go right down the ear, cans or otherwise. But if you can, I think that there are some low-gain Bluetooth receivers. So if you have normal hearing, you can have what looks like a hearing aid. It's actually a form of a personal sound amplification product. You can have that coupled through your playlist on your iPhone. There probably won't be a big difference between Android and iPhone in this sense because there's no live performance, so you have no visual cues to worry about. But if there's live performance, of course, you want to stay away from the Android. So if you can use your own hearing aids, that's great. And you can couple it with Bluetooth, a telecoil, direct audio input, or any other system that might come up in the future.
Great.
Someone actually had written in the question, EU is European Union. Thank you. I just had one of those brain delays, and I couldn't figure that out. Thank you so much. That was Sarah Denial. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Let's see. So there's a question here that asks, where did your passion for this topic come from?
Oh, lordy, lordy, lordy. I'm not a musician. My son calls me a music technician. I play the music, but I'm, if I'm, let's say, doing jazz, I look around and I see someone's playing F sharp, so I figure, well, maybe I'm in G, and by the time I transpose on my clarinet, we are into a different key. But I'm very technically looking at that. So music, I'm not a musician, and I must admit, I listen to all talk radio. I don't even listen to music. I'm not even sure if I like most forms of music, but I like the problems that music poses. So from a purely audiologic engineering perspective, I can bring good common sense science and clinical knowledge to help the hard of hearing person. If I wasn't helping a hard of hearing person to appreciate something more, I wouldn't do it. So I have no great love of music, but I have love of my patients and my clients. I had a client not too long ago who was a student at a community college, and she was failing her ear training class. She was in a music program, and I saw her, and we just arranged with the college to have her ear training done on more the left-hand side of the piano keyboard, a lower frequency note where she had better hearing. Instead of getting 20% on her ear training class, she got 84% and passed and was much happier for it. So I think my passion is my patients, not music. I can actually do music. Music is okay, but I'm an all-talk radio listener.
And again, we have just a couple of minutes left here for Q&A, but there is room for a couple more questions. There is one right now in the box, so I'll go ahead and ask. Do you think that the new Shock microphones, which use bone conduction, are better than earbuds to protect the user's hearing?
No, the microphone is never an issue. Hearing aid microphones since the late 1980s have been able to transduce 115 decibels without distortion. Of course, later on in the hearing aid circuitry, you want to ensure that the output of the hearing aid, the loudspeaker that goes into your ear ultimately, is not over a certain level. Overly loud sounds coming into the ear through the hearing aid can affect your hearing, but not the input to the microphone. So think of the hearing aid or cochlear implant system as the microphone, the digitization product, what we call the front end, the programming that the audiologist does, and then the loudspeaker, the output at the end. So it's the output that you want to regulate to make sure the sounds are not good, not high. Whether it's air conducted sound or bone conducted sound through a bone conductor is no difference. Bone conduction loses a lot of energy when it goes into the skull, but unfortunately bone conduction sound is never what we call flat. It transmits some frequencies 2 octaves below the top note of the piano keyboard, much better, around 1,000 hertz than other frequencies. Some people like the quality of that sound. If you're a swimmer, of course, you want to listen to your earphones, you have to use something like bone conduction. And there are swimmers, bone conduction hearing aids. Transducers or earphones, rather, I should say, for that. Also, an advantage of bone conduction, listening to music while you're bike riding or riding your motorcycle, it doesn't occlude your ears. You don't block off your ears, so you can still hear the environment around you. You can have bone conductors. These are things that go behind the ear. They're not new, but I don't think they're safer. I think, and I don't think the sound quality is as good as air conduction, but in the sense that they're not in the ear, and you can hear the truck coming up behind you better. I think in that sense, it's good.
Great. So Marshall, that kind of, we only have a couple of minutes left, and that kind of resumes our Q&A session. I do have Christopher Sutton, our National Executive Director, on the line that will give some closing remarks, unless if you'd like, Marshall, to have any closing words here before I hand over to Christopher.
Well, thank you, Christiane. I'd like to thank you people for taking a beautiful sunny afternoon. I'm assuming it's sunny across the country, but certainly is beautiful out here in Toronto, for being inside listening to me. I don't know all the answers. I'm trying to find all the answers, and that's my life's passion, I guess. And you have my email. Feel free to email me. I think having these webinars, which was one of Chris's wonderful, Chris has not just bad ideas, he has good ideas too, but I think most of what Chris's ideas are very wonderful. I think this development of a webinar series for CHA and the members of CHA is a wonderful idea, and I think in the future is very good. You're going to get people from all across the country being able to contribute in any way they can in a very bite-sized, reasonable format, and so I thank you, Christiane and Chris Sutton, for having me on here. I'm the inaugural one, so I guess I get to put that in my CV. Thank you.
Christopher?
Thank you, Marshall, for joining us today. It's been a wonderful learning experience. I've learned more about you in this past hour. I do want to thank you for sharing your passion with us and sharing your knowledge and really teaching us all that you have. Everyone, I'd also like to echo Marshall's words and say we're very excited at the Canadian Hard of Hearing Association to be able to start offering this webinars. We want to be hosting these on a regular basis, bi-monthly or monthly. So I'm asking you to reach out and send us an email of some ideas and suggestions or topics you would like to see, or any speakers, so we can start organizing them. One of the great things about CHA, it connects people. It allows us to relate to another, to help people, to understand. And we're with a group of people that understand what we've been going through in our experiences. So it's very critical that we come together as an organization and as members and as people of the community to be able to share this stuff. So I'm so pleased that you were able to join us today, Marshall, for our very first educational webinar. And I do look forward to all that we have to offer in the future. So everyone, with that, I'd like to thank you for coming today and do wish you a very enjoyable rest of the week. And stay tuned to learn about more webinars we plan to host in the future and some very, very, very exciting initiatives that will be coming forward from CHA in the days and months and weeks to come. So with that, thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you all. Thanks, Chris.